Russell's Bogle. Bogles live under floorboards and up chimneys and in outhouses and the back of cupboards. They're a sort of ghost, or maybe a sort of goblin, or a mixture of the two. They're more solid than a ghost because they can pick things up and move them, but they're certainly not human. If you get a good one living in your house, life can be easy, because if you leave them a bowl of milk and some bread every night, they'll do work for you. They'll sweep the floors, do the washing up, clean the windows. Or, if you live on a farm, they'll cut hay and corn, groom horses, and collect eggs. Some of them are a bit contrary. If you leave the house in a mess when you go to bed, and provided there's a bowl of milk and some bread in the middle of the mess, they'll eat the bread, drink the milk, and tidy the house up. But if you leave the house tidy, they'll drink the milk, eat the bread, and put everything where it shouldn't be. Ashes on the floor, rubbish in the chairs, coals in the bread oven, and the cat in the dairy. Some Bogles are just bad and a nuisance. They blow out the fire, smash crockery, sour milk, turn eggs bad, pull the bedclothes off sleeping people, hammer on the roof to wake everyone up, and every other bad turn and trick there is. There was a farmer once named Jim Russell who was plagued by one of these malicious Bogles. He wasn't married, and he had a hard job managing the little farm his parents had left him on his own. The Bogle came with the farm. It had been there longer than the Russells had, and was once a good, helpful Bogle. Then, one of Jim's ancestors had thanked it for harvesting his crops in a single night, and the Bogle had held this against the whole family ever since. Bogles hate being thanked for anything. No one knows why. They just do. It's their way. Sometimes, if you thank a Bogle, they sulk, go away, and never come back. But this Bogle had stayed for revenge. It had tormented every Russell who had worked that farm for 100 years, all because one Russell had been unable to keep his mouth shut on thank you. While Jim's father had been alive, Jim hadn't suffered too much, because the Bogle had pestered his father. Once he became the farmer, however, Jim never got a good night's sleep. If the Bogle wasn't pulling at his bedclothes, or scratching his headboard, or hammering on the wall above his head, then Jim was too worried about what it was doing to get any sleep. If the Bogle left him alone, he knew that when he got up in the morning, he was going to find his horses' manes and tails tied in tangles and knots, and their hides all lathered with sweat from the Bogle's riding. Or he was going to find the cows milked and the milk spoiled, or his whole house overturned with no piece of furniture standing on its legs and every cupboard and drawer emptied of its contents. Jim couldn't stop the Bogle doing anything it wanted to do. It was stronger than he was. If he stayed in the house, it went to the stables. If he stood guard in the stables, it went to the cowshed. If he went there, then the Bogle took itself off to his barn, or back to the house. People told him to hang stones with holes in them over the horses' stalls to keep the Bogle away, or rowan branches, or red thread. But none of that worked, because the Bogle had been at the farm before the Russell family. It had a right to be there. The place was even called Bogle's Hole Farm. The Bogle just tore down the stones and the branches and the thread. Then it took the horses' shoes off and put them on again, back to front. No one could make a farm pay with this kind of thing going on. Jim couldn't make money from milk because the Bogle so often spoiled it. He had no crops to sell because the Bogle carried his harvest over the countryside, dumping it in rivers and other people's yards. No one wanted to buy his animals because they were so nervous and skinny after being harried by the Bogle. Jim knew that he was soon going to be penniless. The Bogle seemed to hate him more than any other Russell, even more than the one who had thanked it. So Jim moved away from the farm and went to stay with relatives in town. The bogle followed him, but it didn't make such a nuisance of itself. After all, Jim's relatives were Robertsons, not Russells, and the bogle had nothing against them. For nights at a time, it left Jim and the Robertsons alone, while it went back to the farm and looked after things there. The bogle kept the land and animals well, as if it had only wanted the farm to itself all along. Jim crept back there from time to time at midday to see how things were, and he found that the animals were all putting on weight and seemed calm and contented, while everything else was in perfect repair and order. It was maddening to see the bogle managing things the way Jim would have done himself if he'd ever been given the chance. He loved the old farm and would have liked to have stayed, but he knew the bogle would never let him live in peace there. So he secretly sold all the animals at the best prices he could get. He thought the bogle would make trouble when he went to the farm with the drovers to take the animals away, but they saw and heard nothing of it. The next thing Jim did was to sell the farm and house, furniture, machinery and all. He had to take a low price, but he didn't care. He wanted to get as far away from the bogle's hole as he could and start again in some place where he could be the good farmer he knew he really was, instead of the poor bogle-haunted fool that everyone pointed out, laughed at and told stories about. So he borrowed money from his relatives to add to that he had raised by the sales, bought himself a passage on a ship, and sailed away to Canada, leaving everything behind and good riddance to it. Once in Montreal, he went to a land agent to buy a new farm. But he had so little money that the only land he could buy was unclaimed land, not the best, out in the wilds, where he would have to work himself to a shadow to prepare the ground before he could even begin farming. But if that was all he could afford, that was what he would have to have. And he was capable of catching himself fish and rabbits and such, and going a little hungry while he made a start. So he bought the land and gave the deeds to a bank in return for money to buy supplies and tools and a pack pony. When he had everything he needed, he loaded the pony and set off into the wilds. It was a long, hard journey. He had to go through forests where no one had ever been before, and that was constant, hard, hot work. He had to cross rivers without bridges, getting soaked and then frozen by the wind. He had to climb mountains and find his way by a map because there were no signposts and no one to tell him the way. He was afraid of bears and wolves and worried all the time that he was lost. And yet he was happy because he was rid of the bogle, and he knew life would be better from now on. And after 3 weeks of hard traveling, his map told him that he had found his way to the acres that were his. He looked down on it from a hill, and he could see straight away where the best place to build a house would be, near the stream, but slightly above it so that it wouldn't be too damp. That's where he would set up his tent for now. He led his pack pony down to the spot. He got his tent set up before nightfall and set water to boil over his fire to make porridge and tea. He lay on his back with his hands behind his neck and sighed. It was nice to be home at last. A voice spoke in the dusk.
"It took you long enough to get here,"
said the bogle.
"I'll teach you to keep me waiting."
And it blew out his fire. Never thank a bogle. You might not be the only one to suffer for it. Granny Bun. In the old days, people used to go hunting hares. They used to set the dogs to chase them while the men ran after on foot. Joel Wheeler was a miner who loved hunting hares. He used to take his dogs out after hares every chance he got, and there were always plenty of other men who wanted to run their dogs too. They soon made hares rare in their neighborhood. The men would take the dogs out and walk over the hills all day and never see a hare. Then Granny Bun's grandson Tommy met them.
"You want a hare to hunt?"
he asked.
"I can find you a hare."
Most of the men were pleased and said they'd give him a shilling if he could.
"I want 3 shillings,
said Tommy.
"You can easily raise it between you all."
Now the men weren't quite so pleased, but Joel Wheeler gave the boy 3 shillings out of his pocket to find a hare.
"I saw one this morning,"
said the boy.
"Come on."
And he ran off. Now all those men were good runners. You get lots of practice in running if you chase hares. But Tommy Bun could outrun all of them. Not even all the dogs could keep up with him.
"He runs like a hare himself,"
Joel Wheeler shouted. Before they'd run half a mile, a hare jumped up in front of them.
"There's your hare!"
shouted Tommy. But the dogs had seen it before he spoke, and they were away, the whippets and the lurchers coursing through the heather and bilberries, with the men panting behind. They had a good chase that day, the first for weeks, even though the hare did get away. Whenever they had trouble finding a hare after that, they asked Tommy Bun to find one for them, and he always did, if they paid him first. And they always had a good long chase, but they never caught a hare that Tommy Bun found. Some of the men started to take their dogs home if they came to the hunt and Tommy Bun was there. When their friends asked why, they said,
"They're strange people, those Buns. We want nothing to do with them." "Don't talk such rubbish,"
Joel said. But half the hunt would go home, saying what was the good of a chase if you never caught the hare? Joel thought the hares got away because the dogs in his hunt weren't good enough. So he walked over to the next village to see his friend Dick Hanley. Dick owned a famous dog named Flyer because she was so fast. She was the best dog in 6 counties. Dick brought Flyer to the next hunt. When Tommy Bun saw Flyer, he said that he hadn't been able to find a hare and they might as well all go home. Joel wouldn't have that. "You've found us a hare every other time," he said, and he caught hold of Tommy by the collar and insisted that he earn his 3 shillings. So Tommy led them off over the hills and, just as always, a hare jumped up in front of them and began running for its life. And Tommy ran as if he was being hunted too. He ran so fast that he was side by side with the hare, and right behind them was Flyer. The hare looked behind her and saw the dog's open mouth and zigged and zagged to escape. But Flyer zigged and zagged too and snapped her teeth a half-inch from the hare's foot. Some of the men, those who had the breath, cheered because they saw that this hare wasn't going to escape from this dog.